Sandy says read, and welcome to the channel. This evening we are going to do a review and discussion of this book. It's Mental Health and Suicide by Dr. Vince Hafeli. Now, let me give you the specs first on this one. It is Mental Health and Suicide, My Personal Story and the Stories of Those Left Behind, with a deep dive into the construction industry. This book is by Vince Hafeli, DBA. The copyright is 2023. This book is 86 pages, plus there are 10 pages in the back with references and appendices. And let's see, let me read you the back cover before we begin. Back cover has, the construction industry has the second highest suicide rate in the United States. While the industry loses 2 to 3 workers each day to job-related accidents, they lose 10 to 15 each day to suicide. Listen as the author tells his story about his phenomenal life until he attempts to end it. He shares 12 individual stories from those who lost someone to suicide. Based on his qualitative interviews, conversations, and lived experiences, he will educate leaders that once they begin addressing mental health and suicide in their organizations, they will have a resilient, loyal workforce and a competitive advantage. Be prepared for an emotional experience as you are taken on an impactful journey. Now, let's see. I want to handle this review with care, with compassion, with dignity and respect. This is obviously a heavy and an important topic for us to discuss. And Vince Hafeli has been on a mission to educate those in the construction industry about the importance of this topic and also about the impact suicide is having in the construction industry. Back in, I want to say 2013, 2017, back in that time frame, a gentleman in the industry had approached me as the editor of Asphalt Pro magazine and asked if I would run some content in the magazine about this topic. And at that time, I was like, well, yes, if this is an issue, then we need to address it. And yes, it is a big issue in our industry. As you just heard from the back cover, it's a big issue in our industry. And at that time, back in 2013, 2014, people were not addressing it the way we finally are now. And Vince is really leading the charge in getting people to understand that we have a workforce that is pretty stressed out. We have a workforce in the construction industry that's coming from various sources, and they're bringing into the industry with them the mental health struggles, the worries and the stressors that come from their background, that come from the work experiences they've already had. And they're bringing those with them when they come to our industry. And we need to have compassion, and we need to have systems in place to assist them when they get here. And then we need to have systems in place to help our workers who are already here. And Vince is doing an awesome job of educating others, getting people to understand. He's doing a good job of getting that message out. And he basically put together a dissertation as he was getting his doctorate to that effect. So I wanted to, beginning at the very front of this book, he talks about that dissertation. He says, "This book is based on my journey and struggles with mental health and suicide, 12 qualitative interviews of those impacted by suicide, some of whom work in the construction industry, and numerous interviews and conversations with industry executives about how they address the topics of mental health and suicide in their organizations. I wrote this book to share stories that illustrate the life-altering effects of suicide on those left behind." Now, before we dive any further into it, I want to hit those words, "those left behind," for just a second. Please remember, when you're talking to someone who you care about, someone who maybe has expressed a desire to harm themselves, or a feeling that they want to harm themselves, if you're talking to someone like that, it is not advised that you mention those they would be leaving behind. And I'm not saying that Vince does that in this book. He doesn't. I've taken a couple of courses. I've been certified in how to talk to someone who is having suicidal thoughts or struggling with, stressors and mental health issues. When you're talking to them, you don't want to put that guilt upon them. I'm not saying that Vince says that in this book. He doesn't. But the fact that we are talking to people who have been left behind in this book might give that implication. I don't want anyone to come away with that thought from this book. There are a couple of programs, and they're mentioned in here, but the QPR program, the Question, Persuade, Refer, that program, the Living Works program, those programs talk to you and teach you and guide you and certify you on how to talk to someone who might be having suicidal thoughts, and they can guide you in how to talk to someone without talking about something that might imply guilt or might imply leaving folks behind. Okay, let's move along. Let's move away from that thought because that is not implied in here. I just don't want that implication to come across. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, all right, let me get to my notes here. You guys, if you're new to the channel, I should warn you, I have to use notes because I am ancient. My brain would be all over the place without the notes. Let me give you a bit of a synopsis from the book. Vince's book begins with, those 2 pages for the abstract. All right. And I want to tell you all that this is not some like doctoral language, with like big, long constructed sentences and difficult to follow language. It's very down to earth, the way Vince is. It was like listening to Vince talk when I was reading through the book. It was like I was sitting across the table from him, listening to him tell his story again. It was very conversational in that manner. So it's not difficult to follow along and understand the messages he's getting across to you in this book. Let's see. What else? From the abstract, we go into a memoir phase of the book. Vince does tell about his childhood, his background, just a very well-adjusted and typical childhood type of situation, right? But he shows through that anyone can grow up to come into a high-stress situation or a bullied situation or some situation where all these factors are stacking up and leading someone to think some self-harm thoughts. Okay, he shows through that memoir that things can lead up to a critical mass if we let them, or if we don't see someone reaching that critical mass and reach out to help. Let's see. And then after the memoir section, after some of those thoughts, we do get into like the chunky middle part of the book where Vince shares these 12 stories, these 12 interviews that he conducted with folks who were willing to share their stories in the book. Folks who have had their lives touched by suicide, someone in their lives or in their work who have died by suicide, and they tell the story of what they're left with, of how they're getting through day to day, how they're coping with life after that. Then let's see. Then we end with ways to implement suicide prevention programs, in our communities, in our workplaces, etc. Now, let's see. In my notes, there's no note in the beginning of this book about sharing excerpts. Usually, there's the note about don't photocopy this, don't share this in some database server, but you can share little excerpts in reviews. There was no note about sharing things in reviews, so I'm going to be very careful about how I share with you guys. Usually I give like a snippet to give you a sense of the author's language or tone or voice. I'm going to be real careful how I do that. And I'm certainly not going to share any of the interviewees' stories with you. I'm not going to quote from any of them. I feel a little strange about that, even though they have given their permission to be in the book. I don't think they intended that some reviewer out here was going to share their stories widely across the internet. So I'm not going to do that. But I am going to share some of the concepts and ideas because these people have shared their hearts and souls and feelings for a purpose. And that purpose is to help others. So let's use this book now to help others as part of this review. Let's see, on page 23, Vince shares some of the factors that were piling up in his life that led to the moment when he thought he needed to end his life. I mean, Vince went through that situation, and some of the factors that were piling up were these. He says, while I had what seemed to be a good childhood, difficult family events were happening, such as he was moving, there were stressful events with his brother, there was poor health of his father, and eventually death of his father at a young age, loss of twin sons. Vince's wife had twins. They lost their twin sons. Loss of brother and mother at an early age. Vince's brother had terminal cancer. Bullying in the workforce, in the workplace. Vince was experiencing that. Coworkers were bullying him in the workplace. And then divorce. And then it says, when I relocated in 2002, my wife and I lost our social support system, and I did not adjust well to our new environment. In 2005, I began to experience psychological issues such as low self-esteem. I also started verbalizing that I could never do anything right at home. To this day, I struggle with that issue. Now he's sharing those things to show you, to show the reader the factors that were just piling up and piling up. And as you can see, some of those days he listed, they didn't all come on in 1 year. They were piling and piling and piling. And when we see those things starting to happen in our own lives, in the life of a son or a daughter or a coworker, we can reach out. You know, in that QPR program, the Living Works program, all these different programs that are available to us to take and to learn from, we can learn how to approach a friend or a colleague or even a boss. We can learn how to approach someone in our lives and say, hey, I see that you're under some pressure. How can I help? Would you like to talk about this? Would you like to talk about that? We learn how to approach someone and talk to them and get them to open up. Now let's look at page 54 and the personal interviews. Oh yeah, the acronym SWOT, S-W-O-T. This was the first time I had seen that acronym, was when reading this book the other night. On page 54, the acronym is SWOT analysis, and it stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So when we're looking at, it says, let us learn that we can be better leaders by sharing our weak moments and learning from our weaknesses, just as we learn through SWOT analysis. So we're analyzing our strengths, our weaknesses, our opportunities, and our threats. So we're looking at these things and analyzing those 4 items in our lives, in the life of the person we're trying to assist, that sort of thing. But this was the first time I had seen that acronym, which learned something new from the book, and which was excellent. Now, on page 58, we learn about giving workers space. And you guys, I mean, doesn't that just sound logical? I mean, doesn't that just sound like, well, of course we would give a worker space if they need space or time to grieve, to get through, to work through the loss of a loved one, right? But one of the folks that Vince interviewed emphasized and shared the fact that her employer gave her that time and that space. And I'm not going to read her exact wording. I don't feel comfortable reading her exact wording, but basically what she was expressing, that in moments when she's struggling, her coworkers give her that grace. Her boss gives her that grace. And that is something that we, as the construction industry, we should internalize that. We should work that into our EAPs. We should work that into just the way we function. If a worker is struggling with grief, if they're struggling with a suicide that has happened, with any emergency that has happened, if they're struggling, we need to give that grace and that space. Then, he talks about safety. And this one, I'm really glad that he brought this up in here. After the interviews, when he's going through some of the ideas and ideas, structures that we could implement in the construction industry, in any industry, he mentions safety. And he says, while not part of my research or my conclusions, I can't help but think that mental health will significantly tie into and improve our safety risk on projects. Workers being more mentally engaged cannot help but support the physical aspects of safety. And that right there is presenteeism, right? If you are present in your task, if you're paying attention, if you're there in the moment, you are a safer worker. That just makes perfect sense. And in fact, I was on a webinar with an MSHA, Mine Safety Health Administration inspector, as the leader. He was speaking to us, and he was talking about inspections, talking about, well, okay, you get it. All right, an MSHA inspector was talking to us, and I asked about the fatalities that are happening, and is MSHA looking into how mental health wellness and the influx of suicides in our industry might be influencing the number of fatalities happening in the mining industry? Because you guys listen to this. I wrote it down. There were 29 fatalities in 2022 in the mining industry. That is up from past years, okay? And then there were 40 mining fatalities in 2023. So it was up to 29, and then it went up to 40. You guys, that's a lot of, that's unacceptable. That's a shame. That's heartbreaking. These are accidents. These are, of course, they're accidents. I mean, but they're fatalities. They're construction workers that we're losing because of accidents. But how many of those are because someone wasn't there in the moment? How many of those are because someone wasn't paying attention? How many of those are because someone was having a mental health struggle, because they were thinking about stressors that, wow, if we could have a program in place that was helping them and taking those stressors off their mind, how many of those could we have prevented? Well, the MSHA inspector was startled by my question and did not have an answer for me. It's maybe that's my mini crusade, is for us to get OSHA and MSHA to start looking into that and saying, hey, when there's a fatality, let's see how distracted was this person? How distracted were the people around them? Because that's a shame. And that's a shame. We should be factoring that in and figuring out a way to help. All right. Then there are resources at the end of Vince's book. There are resources on my magazine's website. We have a suicide prevention page on theasphaltpro.com. I'm going to give you links to Vince's page, to my page. There is a suicide in construction awareness proclamation that Vince started. He wants to get just an absolute ton of signatures on this thing to show that, yes, you are aware that there is a problem, there is an epidemic, there's a situation happening in the construction industry, and you are willing to talk. You are willing to have that conversation. You are willing to expand that conversation to help. That's it. So if you would like to sign that proclamation, I will have that link for you in the drop-down box below. You don't have to be in the construction industry to care about the construction industry workers. You can care about people and not be actually in the industry with them. So I will put that link in this drop-down box below, along with a link to Vince's TED Talk about this issue. And that's it. You guys, this was a very informative, straightforward, down-to-earth, educational dissertation from Vince. I'm glad that he put his dissertation into book form. I recommend this if you are a leader in the construction industry, if you are a worker in the construction industry, if you are someone who is just interested in what's going on with suicide awareness, with mental health issues in the construction industry at large. This is a good book to look into, be aware of. And like I said, it was fairly short. What did I say? How many pages? 86. That's not a long read. It did not take me long to get through this and yet get something good out of it, something useful. I can highly recommend this from Vince. I'll put links in the drop-down box below. You guys, thumbs up for doing something about this epidemic. And please subscribe to the channel. I ask you to please click the bell notification icon so that you're notified each time I do something important here on the channel as well. Thank you for tuning in.